To European eyes, it looked like a mistake. A slab of meat, gray and shrunken, left for 12 hours beside smoldering wood. No sear, no reduction, no chef correcting course along the way. Just heat, smoke, and time. From a country that, as far as Europe was concerned, had never learned the first rule of meat. Don't overcook it. Dry, ruined, proof of a culture too young, too impatient to know any better. Then the fork went in. Not the idea of the food itself, in front of someone who had shown up ready to be unimpressed. What they found wasn't dry. It wasn't overcooked. It was tender in a way that no fast technique could fake. No reduction could rush. No sear could substitute for. The meat didn't confirm what 20 minutes of judgment had decided. It quietly dismantled it, one bite at a time. What made that bite possible was never an accident, and it was never a shortcut. It took fuel most countries never had in abundance, land most countries had long since run out of, and generations willing to let a fire burn all night without touching it. A kind of patience that looks, from the outside, almost like restraint. The thing Europe had assumed America lacked turned out to be the thing America had simply been quiet about the whole time.
HEB trying some proper Texas barbecue. Have a look at this.
Wow, this is nice. This is good food.
You know it's good when it just falls off a bone. Look at that.
Wow.
That is gorgeous.
Wow, this is the biggest rib I've ever seen.
Dad, HEB barbecue out of 10 then.
10 out of 10. Unbelievable.
Today, I will try Texas barbecue for the first time as a German. So the beans have meat in it too? Pork and beef? This is a kinky country. Okay, it's been 25 seconds. We already have like 2,500 calories on this plate.
25 seconds and it's gonna take 2 years off of your life.
Oh my God, look at this. I think this is the beverage that makes the frogs gay in America.
Massive shout out to HEB barbecue manager John and pitmaster Samuel for a fantastic experience on some top-notch food. Cheers, lads.
Ask a butcher in 19th century Texas what the least valuable part of a cow was, and the answer would not have been a delicacy. It would have been the brisket, a thick, fibrous slab of muscle from the animal's chest, laced with so much connective tissue that most cooks of the era considered it barely edible. Fast cooking turned it into something closer to leather. It sold for pennies, when it sold at all. And that single unglamorous fact that America had an oversupply of the toughest, cheapest cuts of meat in the Western world is where its most celebrated cuisine actually begins. The surplus was not an accident of taste. It was an accident of scale. After the Civil War, Texas found itself sitting on an estimated 5 million cattle and almost no local market large enough to absorb them. Ranchers drove herds north along trails like the Chisholm, selling off the prime cuts to railheads and packing houses bound for northern cities. What stayed behind, in smokehouses and worker kitchens across the South, was everything the distant markets did not want. The shoulders, the briskets, the cuts so dense with collagen that no quick method of cooking could make them worth eating. Europe, by contrast, had spent centuries building a butchery system where prime cuts were the default expectation for anyone with the means to cook, and tough cuts were handled the way peasant cooking always had, braised in liquid, stewed low, disguised in a pot, rather than celebrated on a plate. What changed the fate of the American brisket was not a new ingredient. It was a discovery about time. Collagen, the tough connective protein that made these cuts unworkable at high heat, behaves differently below the boiling point of water. Held for hours at a low, steady temperature, roughly 95 to 100 degrees Celsius internally, collagen slowly dissolves into gelatin, the same transformation that makes a slow braised short rib fall apart in a French kitchen. The difference in Texas was that this transformation happened dry, inside a smoke chamber, over an open fire that needed tending for half a day rather than in a sealed pot on a stove. It required nobody's investment except time. And time, unlike a good cut of meat, was something a rural, agrarian, cattle-driven economy had in reliable supply. A worthless piece of meat and an abundance of unpaid hours turned out to be exactly the ingredients needed to invent a cuisine. This is the part European skepticism consistently missed. It assumed a hierarchy where good cooking rescues good ingredients and bad ingredients simply stay bad. American barbecue inverted that logic entirely. The worse the cut, the more collagen it carried, and the more collagen it carried, the more spectacular the transformation once heat and time were finally allowed to do their work properly. The brisket that a French butcher would have set aside for stock became, in a Texas smokehouse, the most prized item on the menu, not despite being cheap and tough, but specifically because it was. Pitmasters were not disguising an inferior product. They were exploiting a property of meat that faster, more prestigious cooking traditions had simply never needed to understand. By the time barbecue restaurants began formalizing this technique in the early 20th century, the meat that once sold for the price of scraps was commanding a premium reputation of its own. Sought out, driven for, waited in line for. The cut had not changed. The chemistry inside it had not changed. What had shifted was the economic and cultural willingness to spend 12 unpaid hours solving a problem that European kitchens had always solved by simply choosing a different piece of meat. But time and cheap meat only explain half of the equation. Turning collagen into gelatin requires something else entirely. A fuel supply large enough and cheap enough to burn for half a day without anyone questioning the cost. A 12-hour fire asked a question that most cooking traditions never have to answer. Who is paying for the wood? In a French kitchen, a fire burns for an hour, maybe two, feeding a technique built around speed and precision. In a Texas smokehouse, a fire burns from before dawn until well after dark, consuming cord after cord of oak or hickory, tended by someone whose only job that day is to keep it exactly where it needs to be. That is not a difference in skill. It is a difference in what each culture could afford to burn. For most of European history, wood was not simply a resource. It was property, and heavily contested property at that. By the medieval period, forests across England, France, and much of continental Europe had been carved into legal categories. Royal forests reserved for the crown, common lands with strict limits on how much timber a household could gather, and private estates where cutting a single unauthorized tree could carry real penalties. The English forest laws under the Norman kings were notorious for this. Entire tracts of woodland were placed under special jurisdiction, with commoners fined or worse for gathering fuel that grew, quite literally, in their own backyard. By the 17th and 18th centuries, centuries of shipbuilding, urban construction, and iron smelting had stripped much of Western Europe's accessible forest cover to the point that firewood itself became a market commodity with real, tracked prices in cities like London and Paris. Burning wood for 12 unbroken hours to slowly cook a single cut of meat was not a technique Europeans overlooked. It was a technique most of them could not have afforded even if someone had suggested it. The American South and the frontier stretches of Texas offered almost the exact inverse condition. Vast stretches of oak, hickory, pecan, and mesquite stood on land that, following westward expansion and the displacement of native populations, was treated as functionally unlimited by the settlers and enslaved laborers doing the cooking. Wood was not rationed by a crown or measured out by a landlord. It was simply there, in quantities no European fuel market of the era could imagine, attached to no legal apparatus that restricted how much of it a household could burn in a single day. A pitmaster feeding a fire from 4 in the morning until dinner was not displaying wealth or excess. He was drawing on a fuel supply so locally abundant that the 12-hour burn cost next to nothing beyond the labor of tending it. Land carried the same asymmetry. Smoking meat at scale requires space. Space for the pit, space for stacked wood, space far enough from a home or a neighbor that half a day of continuous smoke does not become a neighborhood dispute. European towns, shaped by centuries of walled cities, tight property lines, and shared courtyards, rarely offered that kind of room to an ordinary household. The American South and the expanding frontier offered exactly the opposite. Land parceled out in sections, homesteads spaced with room to spare, a settlement pattern built around the assumption that space was not the scarce resource. What Europe treated as a luxury, an entire day's worth of fuel and an entire yard's worth of room, both devoted to a single piece of meat. America simply had lying around. None of this made barbecue an inevitability. Abundant wood and open land do not, on their own, produce a cuisine. They only removed the two obstacles that would have made one impossible. What filled that opening was culture. Waves of German, Czech, and African influence converging on cheap cattle, abundant timber, and unclaimed space. Each group solving the same problem of tough meat and free fuel in a slightly different way, in a slightly different part of the map. And that divergence is exactly why no two American states, to this day, can agree on what barbecue is actually supposed to taste like. Ask a pitmaster in Lockhart, Texas, what makes real barbecue, and the answer will involve beef, black pepper, and almost nothing else. No sauce worth mentioning, no sweetness, just smoke and salt doing the work. Drive 14 hours east to eastern North Carolina, and the same word describes something entirely different. Whole hog, chopped fine, dressed in a thin vinegar and pepper sauce, with no tomato in sight. Cross into South Carolina, and the sauce turns yellow. Built on mustard instead. Head north to Kansas City, and it becomes thick, sweet, tomato-based, ladled generously over a wider range of meats than any single Texas or Carolina pit would recognize as orthodox. 4 regions, 4 fundamentally different definitions of the same word, each one certain the others were doing it wrong. That disagreement is not a flaw in American barbecue. It is the clearest evidence of how the cuisine was actually built. Europe never had this problem, because Europe never had this kind of vacuum. French cooking had Paris, and eventually it had Escoffier, a single codifying figure whose brigade system, standardized techniques, and published references gave the entire national cuisine a shared vocabulary, taught in the same terms whether the kitchen was in Lyon or Marseille. Italy had regional variation too, but even that variation moved through centuries of trade routes, church influence, and eventually a unified state that slowly wore the sharpest edges off local difference. Culinary authority in Europe, however contested at the edges, generally flowed downward from an identifiable center, a court, a capital, a canonical text. Someone, somewhere, was in a position to declare what correct technique looked like, and enough of the country was close enough to hear it. The American South, after the Civil War, had no such center, and for a specific structural reason. It had no unified food economy to anchor one. Transportation was slow and regional. Railroads connected some areas to national markets decades before they reached others. Immigrant communities settled in dense, isolated pockets, rather than dispersing evenly across a shared urban culture. German and Czech butchers concentrated specifically in the Texas Hill Country, bringing smoked sausage traditions from home that fused with the existing beef economy to produce Texas's meat-forward sauce-light style. English colonial settlers, arriving centuries earlier along the Carolina coast with cheap imported vinegar as a preservation staple, built a sauce tradition around what was already sitting in their pantry rather than what any culinary authority told them to use. Kansas City, growing later as a major railway and stockyard hub, absorbed a wider mix of migrants, and crucially, developed alongside the early 20th century commercial ketchup industry, giving it access to a cheap, mass-produced tomato base that older regional traditions simply never had available when their own styles were solidifying. Each of these was a local solution to the same underlying problem: tough meat, open fire, whatever ingredients happened to be cheapest and closest, arrived at independently, without cross-reference. Because no railroad, no printed cookbook, and no central culinary institution connected these communities closely enough to standardize the answer. By the time barbecue restaurants began drawing wider attention in the 20th century, the regional splits were already generations deep, defended with the kind of loyalty usually reserved for something closer to religion than recipe. What looks, from a European vantage point, like chaos, a country that cannot agree on its own national dish, is actually the fingerprint of exactly how that dish was made. Not handed down from a capital, but assembled independently in isolated pockets by people solving an identical problem with whatever history had left in their pantry. The sauce sitting on a plate in Raleigh versus one in Kansas City is not a difference of taste. It is a difference of which ship, which migration, and which decade first arrived in that particular corner of the map. Long before brisket became a Texas signature or vinegar sauce became a Carolina identity, someone had to be the one standing over the pit for 12 hours, and across most of the antebellum South, that someone was enslaved. Barbecue in America did not begin as a hobby or a weekend pursuit. It began as forced labor, a technique perfected not by hobbyist pitmasters with time to spare, but by enslaved cooks tasked with turning the cheapest, least valuable parts of an animal into something a plantation household would actually eat. The skill required to manage a live fire for half a day, judging heat by feel and smoke by color rather than by thermometer, was a specialized craft, and it belonged almost entirely to people who received no credit, no wages, and no ownership over what they had created. That authorship gap did not close after emancipation. It shifted into a different, though still deeply unequal, shape. Formerly enslaved cooks and their descendants carried the technical knowledge of barbecue directly into the post-war Southern economy, at a moment when almost every other path to property ownership or business ownership remained legally or socially blocked to Black Americans. Barbecue, unlike banking, law, or manufacturing, required no formal credential and no white-controlled institution's approval to practice. Only a pit, a fire, and the accumulated technique that had already been mastered under far worse conditions. It became one of the very few trades where Black expertise could convert directly into a livelihood without first passing through a system designed to deny it one. What followed was the quiet construction of a parallel economy running alongside, rather than through, the segregated commercial world of the Jim Crow South. Black-owned barbecue stands and smokehouses opened in towns across Texas, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, often serving customers of both races, even in an era when almost no other business could. A barbecue window in some towns became one of the only physical spaces where segregation's rigid boundaries briefly, informally, and profitably loosened, not because the surrounding laws had softened, but because demand for the food outweighed the era's usual social enforcement. Money did what public policy would not. It moved toward the best pit, regardless of who was standing in front of it. This is where the economics get specific rather than sentimental. Segregation-era Black barbecue businesses operated almost entirely outside white-controlled capital. No bank loans, no Chamber of Commerce backing, no access to the financing networks that built competing white-owned restaurants. What they had instead was technique passed through direct apprenticeship, master to family member to employee, an oral transmission system that, ironically, preserved regional methods with more fidelity than any written recipe could have. The absence of institutional support forced a kind of purity of practice. Styles stayed close to their origins for longer in Black-owned smokehouses, precisely because there was no capital available to modernize, standardize, or dilute them. By the time barbecue entered the mainstream American food economy in the 20th century, cookbooks, competition circuits, national restaurant chains, much of what got packaged and sold as regional tradition had been developed, refined, and kept alive for generations inside a segregated, undercapitalized, and largely uncredited Black culinary economy. The names on the awards and the magazine features did not always match the names actually responsible for the technique. The story so far explains who built American barbecue and why. What it does not yet explain is why Europe, watching all of this unfold from across the ocean, never managed to build anything resembling it at home, even in the cities with plenty of meat, plenty of history, and plenty of appetite. In 2017, a barbecue restaurant trying to open in central London ran into a problem that no Texas pitmaster has ever had to think about, proving, to a city council's satisfaction, that a wood-fired smoker would not violate the UK's Clean Air Act. The law, first passed in 1956 and repeatedly tightened since, was written to end the coal smoke fog that had killed thousands of Londoners during the Great Smog of 1952. It was never written with brisket in mind, but a rule designed to stop a coal furnace from choking a neighborhood does not distinguish between industrial smoke and culinary smoke. Both get treated as the same regulated hazard, and both require the same permits, filtration systems, and proof of compliance before a single log can legally burn. This is the quiet, procedural reason American-style barbecue never developed into a European tradition at anything close to the same scale, and it has almost nothing to do with taste. Continuous wood smoke, sustained for 12 hours in dense urban environments, runs directly into more than a century of European air quality regulation that emerged from real, well-documented public health crises. London's Clean Air Acts followed a smog event that hospitalized thousands. Germany's Bundesemissionsschutzgesetz, its federal emissions control law, sets specific limits on particulate output from commercial cooking installations, treating a large smoker much the way it would treat a small industrial furnace. France's ICPE framework, installations classified as environmentally regulated, requires permits for any operation producing sustained smoke output above a defined threshold, a bureaucratic process that can take months and was never designed with a restaurant's timeline in mind. None of these laws targeted barbecue specifically. They didn't need to. Barbecue simply happened to be exactly the kind of activity they were built to catch. American regulation developed along a different historical track for a specific structural reason: population density. The Great American Smog Crises, Los Angeles in the 1940s, Pittsburgh's industrial haze, produced their own regulatory response, culminating in the Clean Air Act of 1970. But that law was calibrated against a country where a smokehouse could sit 200 feet from the nearest structure, surrounded by exactly the kind of open land discussed earlier in the story. American emissions law had the luxury of drawing its lines around industrial-scale pollution because ordinary residential and commercial smoke had enough physical distance from its neighbors to disperse before it became anyone's legal problem. European emissions law, built for cities where buildings share walls and courtyards share air, drew its lines much closer because there was no equivalent distance to rely on. The downstream effect shows up directly in what a European restaurant is allowed to build. Commercial kitchens across the EU face specific limits on particulate and volatile organic compound output, frequently requiring costly filtration and scrubber systems before a wood smoker can be legally installed at all, infrastructure that adds tens of thousands of euros to a restaurant's opening costs before it serves a single plate. A handful of high-end European restaurants have absorbed that cost in recent years, treating imported Texas-style smokers as a premium investment rather than a standard kitchen appliance. But a cost structure that only makes sense at the premium end of a market cannot produce the roadside smokehouse economy that built American barbecue in the first place. The small, family-run pit that needed nothing more than land, wood, and time to open its doors. What looks, from the outside, like a simple absence of tradition is really the visible result of two countries solving the same environmental problem under two entirely different population geometries, one measuring distance in miles, the other in shared walls. And that same geometry, as it turns out, shaped something even more fundamental than where the smoke was allowed to go. It shaped who was even permitted to gather around the fire in the first place. There is a version of this story that ends with a scoreboard: Europe wrong, America right, certainty humbled by 12 patient hours of smoke. But that reading misses what actually happened because nothing about American barbecue ever argued that fast cooking was inferior. A perfect sear still requires exactly the kind of precision Europe spent centuries mastering. What barbecue proved was something narrower and in its way more unsettling, that an entire cuisine could be built not from skill applied quickly, but from conditions most cultures never have the luxury to combine: cheap fuel nobody rationed, land nobody had to share, decades nobody was forced to rush, and hands that received none of the credit for making it work. That is the part worth sitting with longer than the food itself. Every dismissed cuisine carries a version of this same quiet arrogance, the assumption that if something worthwhile existed, the people already paying attention would have found it first. Europe did not miss American barbecue because Europe lacked good cooks. It missed it because good cooking, in the European sense, was never built to notice a technique that succeeds by doing almost nothing for almost forever. The oversight wasn't a failure of taste. It was a blind spot built directly into what taste had been trained to look for. Which raises the harder question: the one that outlasts the brisket and the smoke ring in the 12 hours it took to get there. How many other things has Patience already solved quietly in some overlooked corner of the world, waiting only for someone certain enough to finally sit down, pick up a fork, and be proven wrong?